thought we were done, but I had a special request by Rick, and he wrote it on the back of a $20 bill, so we'll do this for Rick now. Ready? Former Presidents George Herbert and President George W. Bush, George Burns, George Jones, George Benson, George C. Scott, George Reeves, George Wallace, George Hallis, George Washington Carver, George Jefferson, George Jetson, George Bard, George Harrison, Boy George, by George, George of the Jungle, George Strait, Chris George, Linda Day George, George Patton, Phyllis George, George Custer, George McCullen, George Foster, George Martin, George Thurgood, George Carlin, George Hamilton, George Raft, George Jessel, Tallulah Gorge, Susan George, Curious George, Georgie Porgy, George Clinton, George Siegel, George McGovern, Jeff George, George Lindsay, George Sanford Brown, George Lucas, George McCrae, George Schultz, George Mikan, Gorgeous George Jr. Come on, Rick, sing along! George Orwell, George Wentz, Tom Brady, George Goebel, George Michael, George Foreman, George Stepanovich, one of my old drinking buddies that still lives back up in Youngstown, Georgetown, George Naismith, George Will, George Montgomery, George Steinbrenner, Georgie Fane, George Mason Men, George Allen, George Rogers, George Gipper, George Gervin, Machine Gun Kelly. His real name was George Harriet, George Kennedy, George Breton, George Mitchell, George Stephanopoulos, Chief Dan George, George London, George Clifton, George Guinness, George Rogers Clark, George Bernard Shaw, George Seifert, Eddie George, any George at all, George Belanda, George Costanza, George Clooney, George Herman, Babe Ruth. How about George Animal Steel? If you like bourbon as much as I do, you drank some George Dickel. And George is on my mind. Yeah. Thank you.